The radar station outside Leningrad was quiet, too quiet. The sky overhead was clear, the screens steady, then a blip, a faint echo. High, far higher than any signal should have been. Technicians scrambled to recalibrate, suspecting a glitch. It wasn't. The object wasn't fast, it was silent, slow by jet standards. But it was high, unreachably high. Within minutes, orders surged across the Soviet air defense network. Missile batteries went hot. Communications barked in clipped Russian. Unidentified aircraft at extreme altitude. Confirm target. Prepare to fire. The SAM operators looked at each other, unsure. The radar tracked the intruder at over 70,000 feet, twice the altitude of most Soviet interceptors. Still, orders were orders. From a hidden base near Minsk, a surface-to-air missile roared skyward, then another. Each weapon streaked toward the upper atmosphere, leaving trails of white fire across the blue canvas. But they never hit their mark. They simply ran out of altitude, burning out miles beneath the intruder. At that same moment, a pilot high above watched the white contrails arc harmlessly below. Through his canopy, he could see the curvature of the earth. He wasn't here to fight. He didn't carry bombs, or even guns. Just cameras, massive, high-resolution lenses aimed down at the earth like a silent god. He was flying a U-2, built by Lockheed, operated by the CIA, designed to do one thing: see everything, and stay untouchable. And tonight, it had done exactly that. On the ground, Soviet radar crews stared at blank screens. Their missiles had failed. Their pilots couldn't climb that high. Their skies were violated, and they couldn't do a thing about it. The brass would demand answers. But they all knew the truth. Something had flown over their heads. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't even see it clearly. And worst of all, they had laughed at it. Weeks earlier, senior Soviet air commanders dismissed the U-2 as a flying coffin, a slow, thin-winged target that couldn't possibly survive against Soviet air defenses. They believed altitude meant nothing against speed and tracking power. They believed their missiles were unstoppable. They believed wrong. Above them, the U-2 soared on, untouched, undetected, watching. And for the first time, the Soviets realized, you can't shoot what you can't reach. Inside the Kremlin's Ministry of Defense, the assumption was absolute. Soviet skies were impenetrable. A dense matrix of radar arrays, early warning posts, interceptor squadrons, and newly deployed surface-to-air missile systems created a cocoon of confidence. Let them try, one air marshal boasted. No Western aircraft will survive past the border. That was the doctrine: faith in firepower, radar coverage, and air denial zones that stretched from the Polish frontier to Vladivostok. The enemy, they believed, could not see what it could not fly over, and even if a reconnaissance aircraft made the attempt, Soviet missiles would catch it long before it reached anything valuable. And then came the U-2. When U.S. overflights began in 1956, Soviet radar stations at first failed to detect the aircraft. On the rare occasion when they did, the response was always the same: scramble fighters, ready anti-aircraft crews, and deploy SA-1 and SA-2 missile batteries. But by the time those systems locked on, the target was already gone, or worse, still cruising above missile ceiling, untouchable. The Soviets couldn't understand how something so slow, barely Mach 0.7, could consistently evade their most advanced defenses. Some thought it was a trick. Others believed it was propaganda. Still others blamed incompetence at radar posts or glitches in missile guidance. But the real cause was far simpler and far more dangerous: altitude. The U-2 didn't fly around Soviet defenses. It flew above them. At 70,000 feet, nearly twice the altitude of most Soviet interceptors, and 20,000 feet above effective missile range, the U-2 simply existed in a different realm. A realm the Soviets had not prepared for. Their entire doctrine, from radar cone alignment to engagement envelopes, was built for threats at mid-altitude, fast-moving, bomb-carrying targets. Not something slow, high, and silent. Yet Moscow's intelligence bureaucracy doubled down. They labeled the U-2 an anomaly, a desperate American stunt, as one internal memo put it. Senior officers assured the Kremlin that their newly developed MiG-17 seconds and radar-guided missiles would soon eliminate the threat. The reality was darker. Each U-2 flight penetrated deeper, photographing air bases, missile silos, and nuclear stockpiles. The data collected was precise. CIA analysts in Langley mapped entire sectors of Soviet infrastructure based on these images. The Americans weren't flying blind. They were building a complete picture of the Soviet Union without ever losing a plane. And the worst part? The Soviets knew they were being watched, and couldn't stop it. Inside the command centers, doubt began to creep in. Were their missiles really effective? Were their aircraft obsolete? Could the West now see everything they built? These were not the questions Soviet officers were trained to ask, but the answers were coming one overflight at a time. The Soviet Air Defense Force, or PVO Strany, had spent years constructing an intricate web of protection. It was designed to repel bombers, outmaneuver fighters, and intercept anything that dared violate Soviet skies. But this vast defense net was stitched together with an assumption so deeply embedded it was never questioned. Every enemy aircraft would fly within reach. Their entire anti-air doctrine depended on that one premise. The layered defense model began with radar stations spread across the Soviet Union's immense frontiers. These radars scanned the skies for incoming threats, relaying data to command posts and missile batteries. Below that skywatch, interceptor squadrons armed with MiG-15 seconds, MiG-17 seconds, and later MiG-19 seconds stood ready to climb and engage hostile aircraft. Supporting them, fixed SAM systems like the SA-1 and SA-2 were stationed around key targets, forming a missile shield designed to intercept at medium altitude. It was a doctrine forged from World War II and hardened during Korea. Anticipate bomber streams, throw radar-guided interceptors at them, and flood the airspace with missiles and flak. The Americans would come in fast and heavy like the B-29 seconds had over Pyongyang. Soviet air defense was ready for that. But the U-2 wasn't a bomber. It didn't fly fast. It didn't even fly aggressively. It floated. At 21,000 meters, it cruised above jet contrails, radar lobes, and effective missile trajectories. Soviet radars, tuned for faster and lower targets, struggled to track it consistently. When they did catch glimpses, lock-ons were fleeting. Engagements failed. SAM crews watched helplessly as their missiles arced upward, then died in the stratosphere, their targets untouched. And yet, despite these failures, Soviet doctrine didn't shift. Commanders simply couldn't believe an aircraft like the U-2, fragile, unarmed, and slow, could truly matter. They dismissed it as a technological gimmick, incapable of surviving once newer interceptors like the MiG-21 came online. Even as overflights increased, and evidence of deep reconnaissance piled up, the belief remained firm. Our sky defenses are strong. This is a temporary nuisance. Worse, Soviet aerospace engineers focused their energy on speed, not altitude. Projects like the MiG-25 emphasized blistering performance, Mach numbers, and climb rates built to chase supersonic bombers. But against the U-2, none of that mattered. It flew so high and slow that pursuing fighters simply stalled out before reaching its level. The doctrine was breaking. Quietly, invisibly, but definitively. Each U-2 mission not only collected data, it exposed a strategic blind spot that Soviet leaders refused to see. The sky, once considered Soviet territory, was now being rented out by American eyes. They just didn't know it yet. On the 4th of July, 1956, while Americans celebrated Independence Day, a slender winged aircraft crossed the northern edge of Soviet airspace. It came from Wiesbaden, West Germany, and banked smoothly over the Baltic, before slicing silently over Leningrad. Below, Soviet radar operators scrambled to interpret the faint signals dancing on their screens. A contact appeared, then vanished, then reappeared, but at a height that didn't make sense. It was the first true overflight of Soviet territory by the U-2, and it would change everything. From the cockpit, the CIA pilot Richard Bissell's Ghost Rider watched the curvature of the Earth. The atmosphere above him was nearly black. The aircraft floated serenely above the clouds, cameras rolling, snapping thousands of high-resolution photos. The mission: capture photographic intelligence on Soviet nuclear facilities, airfields, and missile testing sites. No fighter scrambled that day could reach it. No SAM even tried. The data collected shocked U.S. intelligence analysts. Photographs revealed long-range bomber bases near Engels, missile test facilities at Kapustin Yar, and the exact layout of radar networks around Moscow. What had once been guesses now became coordinates. And it didn't stop there. Each subsequent flight penetrated deeper. One mission flew directly over Moscow. Another soared over the industrial Urals. The cameras, precise down to a meter, captured rail yards, silo caps, and even the shadows of individual radar dishes. The U-2 could fly for 9 hours, covering over 4,000 miles in a single sortie. Each pass became a mosaic tile in the West's emerging picture of the Soviet Union's true military posture. To the Soviets, it was a ghost war. They knew they were being watched. Radar logs proved it, but they couldn't shoot the intruder down. Pilots from multiple air defense districts reported visual contact, often too far below the target to engage. Some reached 50,000 feet before stalling out, watching the U-2 float gently above them like a silver crucifix against the stratosphere. This wasn't supposed to happen. Their vaunted defenses, so proudly declared impenetrable in state media, were being bypassed like fence posts. And the implications were catastrophic. If the Americans could fly over missile fields and nuclear storage sites undetected, what else could they see? What else could they prepare for? Yet, despite the clear breach, the Soviet response was hesitant. For months, Soviet leadership oscillated between denial and fury. Nikita Khrushchev, humiliated but cautious, hesitated to retaliate. He feared an escalation, a justification for U.S. airstrikes. So instead, he ordered more radar calibration, more fighter patrols, and the urgent acceleration of new SAM systems. But none of it worked. By the end of 1957, over 20 U-2 missions had entered Soviet airspace. Not one had been hit. Not one had failed. To the Americans, it was a triumph of technology and daring. To the Soviets, it was a silent invasion they couldn't stop. The sky was no longer a shield. It was now a window, and America was looking straight through it. The reports arrived in thick envelopes, stamped top secret, and marked with red urgency seals. They came from radar stations in Pskov, Kaliningrad, and deep inside the Urals. All said the same thing. An unidentified aircraft had entered Soviet airspace, cruised at extreme altitude, and exited without interception. The Politburo didn't believe it. In fact, they couldn't afford to believe it. To acknowledge that American aircraft were flying over Soviet territory with impunity, photographing missile sites, air bases, and critical infrastructure would mean admitting a gaping hole in the Red Empire's armor. It would mean admitting to the world that the vast, layered anti-air systems they had spent billions of rubles developing were obsolete. So they lied. Khrushchev publicly dismissed reports of American overflights as capitalist fantasies. Soviet newspapers printed bold denials. When questioned by international journalists, the Kremlin's press officers scoffed. No American aircraft can enter Soviet airspace and live. Our skies are guarded by steel. But behind closed doors, panic was setting in. At a military meeting in late 1957, the commander of the PVO Marshal Sergei Biryuzov presented chilling evidence. Not only had over a dozen U-2 seconds been tracked over Soviet territory, but photographic evidence recovered through espionage proved the Americans had detailed images of nuclear missile sites. The implications were clear. NATO knew Soviet positions in startling detail. The response from Khrushchev? Fix it. Immediately. Fixing it, however, wasn't so easy. MiG 17 seconds and 19 seconds couldn't climb high enough. Even experimental variants failed to maintain combat performance beyond 55,000 feet. The missiles, the SA-1 and early SA-2, struggled with guidance above 60,000 feet. Radar systems were calibrated for high-speed, low to mid-altitude threats, not high-altitude loiterers. Desperate, the Soviets expanded SA-2 development and poured money into experimental radar arrays capable of vertical scanning, but development lagged behind. For every new tweak, the U-2 flew another mission. They changed altitude, varied flight paths, even entered over new sectors just to prove that no corner of the USSR was safe. Some Soviet officers suspected a deeper conspiracy. Could the U-2 be more than a plane? A drone? A balloon? A decoy? There were even theories that the Americans had cracked Soviet radar codes feeding false data to make their spy planes invisible. None of it was true. But the fact that such theories were taken seriously only proved the depth of Soviet confusion. Because if the reality was true, if America really had an aircraft that could see everything and be hit by nothing, then the game had changed. And the Soviets weren't ready to admit it. Not yet. By early 1958, with nearly 2 years of successful overflights behind them, the Americans had reason to believe the U-2 was untouchable. The Soviets, for their part, had formulated a theory, one they clung to not out of confidence, but out of desperation. They believed the U-2's survivability came not from altitude, but from American deception. According to internal memos circulated within the Soviet air defense community, the most plausible explanation for the U-2's success was spoofing. Soviet engineers posited that the aircraft used advanced electronic warfare systems, jamming radars, scrambling missile lock-on codes, even transmitting false IFF identification, friend or foe signals. This theory gave the Soviets comfort. It meant their missiles weren't broken. Their radars weren't obsolete. It wasn't their doctrine that had failed, it was just that the Americans had found a trick, but it wasn't a trick. The U-2 didn't jam radars. It didn't scramble missile systems. It didn't carry ECM pods or spoofing devices. It didn't need to. Its defense was simpler and far more terrifying for Soviet planners. Altitude, plus timing, plus trajectory. The plane flew too high to intercept and operated under complete operational silence. Its radios stayed cold. Its path was predictable only to those who controlled its launch. Still, the Soviets pressed ahead with the deception theory. They expanded jamming defenses. SAM crews were retrained to lock on to weak signals. Fighter squadrons were drilled in blind intercept protocols, using raw radar tracking without IFF dependency. Soviet radar teams were even instructed to look for phantom trails, non-linear radar echoes that might indicate spoofed tracks. None of it worked. And in their obsession with electronic trickery, the Soviets missed the real problem. Their ceiling was too low. The SA-1 system, though impressive on paper, lacked the fuel and guidance precision to strike targets above 65,000 feet. Radar networks, designed to track bombers like the B-47, used downward scanning dishes optimized for speed, not vertical range. The irony? American engineers had counted on exactly this miscalculation. Kelly Johnson, chief designer at Lockheed's Skunk Works, had warned the CIA, "The U-2 is not invisible, it is vulnerable, but it will fly where no system exists." That prediction became a doctrine. The U.S. didn't invest in stealth yet, they invested in flying higher than fear. The Soviets didn't need new radars. They didn't need counter-jamming protocols. They needed to accept a harder truth. They had built an air defense system for the wrong war. As U-2 flights continued to mock Soviet airspace, a new internal narrative began to take root, one born not from technology, but psychology. If the aircraft could not be shot down, then perhaps it didn't matter. This was the second wrong theory, that the U-2 was merely a nuisance, a photo-snapping mosquito, strategically irrelevant in the grand scale of nuclear parity and Cold War deterrence. Senior commanders in the Soviet Air Defense Force, unable to explain their failure to stop the intrusions, pivoted. In closed meetings, they declared that even if the U.S. collected photographs. Those images would not change strategic outcomes. They claimed the West still didn't understand the depth or mobility of Soviet forces, and that overhead surveillance, no matter how accurate, could never capture intent. This theory was not technical. It was political, and it was wrong. What the Soviets failed to grasp was that the U-2's high-altitude cameras weren't just taking snapshots. They were building a playbook. Each photograph was stitched into massive mosaics at CIA headquarters. Analysts could track the expansion of missile sites, measure the spacing between railway cars, estimate bomber dispersal tactics, and even count how long a nuclear convoy stayed mobile. The U-2 wasn't guessing at Soviet strength. It was measuring it, and that measurement had consequences. The myth of the missile gap, the belief in Washington that the Soviets had far more ICBMs than the U.S., was disproven by U-2 imagery. Instead of hundreds of missile silos, analysts counted fewer than 24. The panic faded. U.S. nuclear policy shifted from catch-up to control. This wasn't nuisance work. This was doctrine-shaping intelligence. Still, the Soviets clung to the belief that U-2 overflights were a provocation, not a threat. Khrushchev even joked to Western diplomats that, "Perhaps you think you can photograph our secrets with a camera from the sky. All you'll see is clouds." Behind closed doors, however, he was furious and increasingly aware that the Americans were mapping his empire in real time. The U-2 didn't carry bombs. It didn't jam signals. It didn't fight. But what it gathered could determine where bombs might fall tomorrow or where they wouldn't. This realization came too late. By downplaying the threat, the Soviets had wasted precious months. The Americans, meanwhile, refined flight patterns, optimized camera angles, and built one of the most advanced intelligence networks in modern military history. The second wrong theory, the idea that knowledge isn't lethal, was more dangerous than the first. Because in the Cold War, knowing was everything. The Soviet Union prided itself on intelligence. The KGB had agents in NATO command centers, technical spies embedded in Western aerospace firms, and informants planted across Berlin, Paris, and Washington. But when it came to the U-2, they saw everything except the truth. By 1959, Soviet analysts had amassed reports from radar crews, air defense units, and fighter squadrons, all pointing to the same disturbing pattern. U-2 seconds were flying deeper, longer, and more confidently. Some overflights tracked straight across the Soviet heartland, from the Barents Sea to the Caspian. Every high-value site was being recorded. Kapustin Yar, Tyuratam, Sary-Shagan, Severodvinsk, and yet, the official position from the Kremlin remained static. The U.S. was bluffing. Why? Because the alternative was unacceptable. To admit that U.S. spy planes had unimpeded access to the Soviet Union was to concede strategic vulnerability, not just militarily, but ideologically. Soviet air defense was supposed to be the most advanced on Earth. Moscow had spent years selling that story to its citizens, allies, and enemies alike. Reversing that narrative would cost more than face. It would cost deterrence. So the intelligence community repressed its own conclusions. Reports were rewritten. Dissenting officers were reassigned. Those who pushed for radical reforms, calling for new high-altitude SAM systems, vertical scan radar, and Mach 3 interceptors, were labeled alarmists. Worse still, some KGB divisions believed the U-2 to be a Western psychological operation, not just a spy plane, but a confidence weapon meant to provoke overreaction and force Soviet defenses to reveal themselves. This theory gained traction, feeding bureaucratic paralysis. After all, if the U-2 was bait, then shooting it down might play directly into CIA hands. The paralysis deepened. One chilling example came in 1958. A U-2 flight crossed over the Soviet Far East, capturing imagery of submarine bases and coastal missile batteries. Despite near real-time radar tracking, the intercept order was delayed 12 minutes, while commanders debated whether it was a decoy or a drone. By the time a MiG-19 was airborne, the U-2 had already banked south and disappeared over Japan. Each failure compounded the next. As U.S. analysts built a clearer picture of Soviet strategic depth, Soviet leadership slid deeper into a fog of indecision. While Lockheed engineers refined camera resolution down to inches, Soviet planners argued over whether Western arrogance was inflating the plane's significance. But it wasn't arrogance. It was accuracy. And in those crucial early years, the U-2 flew not because the Soviets couldn't stop it, but because they refused to accept that they had to. By the time Moscow understood the scale of its exposure, it was too late. The Americans had already seen everything they needed, and no missile could unsee what the U-2 had captured. To understand the threat the U-2 posed to Soviet security, one must look beyond the aircraft itself. Because the U-2 was not just a spy plane, it was the visible tip of an invisible system, a Cold War intelligence machine built by the CIA, Lockheed, and the National Photographic Interpretation Center, a system that didn't just collect information, it weaponized it. At the heart of this system was the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, which commissioned the U-2 as part of Project Aquatone. From the moment it lifted off its desert runways in Nevada and Turkey, the U-2 flew for one reason: to see what no satellite or agent could see, to peel back the Iron Curtain from 13 miles above. But what made the U-2 so deadly was not its altitude or camera lens. It was what followed each flight. When a U-2 returned from a mission, its film canisters were rushed to photo labs near Washington, D.C., where high-resolution images were developed, categorized, and analyzed by specialists. These analysts, trained to detect everything from missile launch gantries to shadow angles on radar dishes, produced detailed maps of Soviet capabilities, often with devastating implications. The imagery was processed at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, where multiple intelligence agencies, CIA, Air Force, NSA, collaborated to cross-reference U-2 data with signals, intelligence, SIGINT, and human reports. Together, these threads formed a living blueprint of Soviet strategic posture. Through U-2 intelligence, the U.S. learned the true number and location of Soviet ICBM sites, the existence of mobile launch systems and their ranges, discrepancies between Soviet rhetoric and actual military readiness, the layout of nuclear storage depots and bomber runways, the deployment cycles of Soviet submarines and their supporting infrastructure. This intel transformed American strategy. The myth of the missile gap, which had driven U.S. military expansion in the late 1950 seconds, was quietly dismantled. U-2 overflights revealed that Soviet ICBM forces were not only smaller than feared, but years behind in deployment. This gave President Eisenhower the political space to resist escalation, knowing he had the advantage of truth. U-2 missions also empowered diplomacy. When Khrushchev threatened Berlin, U.S. leaders consulted photographic maps of Soviet troop concentrations, seeing bluster, not readiness. When nuclear warheads were suspected in Cuba, the CIA turned again to U-2 seconds and exposed them, triggering the 1962 crisis. Even battlefield planning changed. The U.S. could now assign bomber routes and targeting lists with surgical precision. Commanders knew exactly where to strike, where defenses were weakest, and how to overwhelm Soviet SAM fields. To the Soviets, the U-2 was a ghost in the sky. To the Americans, it was a scalpel in the dark. The system worked because it was unified hardware, software, human analysis, and policy flowing seamlessly. Every overflight was a symphony of planning: mission briefings, flight path calculations, fuel loads, radio silence windows, contingency recovery zones, and weather modeling. And in the center of it all was one truth: information wins wars before they start. While the Soviets built more missiles and radars, the Americans built context insight advantage. The U-2 didn't drop bombs. It didn't need to. It dropped certainty, and certainty is lethal. The final blow came not from a missile interception, but from the blinding spotlight of global exposure. May 1, 1960, a date forever etched into Cold War history. The Soviets had waited 4 long years, dozens of overflights, countless failed intercepts, but finally, in the sky over Sverdlovsk, the Soviet air defense forces caught a break. Francis Gary Powers, a CIA pilot on another high-risk U-2 mission, was flying what should have been a routine path, in from Peshawar, over the Urals, then out through Norway. But this time, Soviet radar locked on earlier, and this time, a new missile, the S-75 Dvina SA-2 guideline, was waiting, freshly refined and fielded specifically to answer the U-2 threat. 3 missiles were launched. One exploded near a MiG-19 sent to intercept Powers. Another hit the U-2. Powers' aircraft shattered at 70,500 feet. Miraculously, he ejected and survived. Even more miraculously for the Soviets, the U-2's airframe, cameras, and parts of the film were largely intact, giving Moscow the evidence they had long lacked. The game was over. At least, it should have been. In Washington, the U.S. government assumed Powers was dead. A cover story was issued. A NASA weather plane had strayed off course. But Khrushchev, knowing the Americans had lied, waited. On May 7th, he stunned the world, producing both the wreckage and the pilot. In a single move, Khrushchev humiliated the United States. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Eisenhower was forced to admit the U.S. had conducted clandestine overflights. A planned summit with Khrushchev in Paris collapsed. Trust between the superpowers disintegrated. The myth of American invincibility built on altitude and silence lay burning in the Sverdlovsk forest. For the Soviets, it was a public relations triumph. State newspapers ran photographs of the U-2 wreckage. Powers' confessions, though limited, were splashed across Pravda. Military officials paraded the SA-2 system as proof of Soviet technological superiority. "No one flies over Soviet skies without consequence," declared Marshal Sokolovsky. But underneath the propaganda, the victory was hollow, because while the U-2 was shot down, its mission had already succeeded. Years of reconnaissance data had been gathered, dozens of targets mapped, doctrinal gaps exposed. The intelligence war was already won, and the U.S. would simply pivot to satellites and drones. Still, for one brief moment, the Soviets had something they hadn't possessed since 1956. Leverage. They had brought down the untouchable. They had exposed the silent war. But even in victory, they learned an uncomfortable truth. The U-2 had flown above their reach for too long, and though the aircraft had finally fallen, the damage it had done to Soviet secrecy was permanent. The ghost had left the sky, but it had already buried the myth. In the wake of the 1960 incident, the Soviet Union rushed to declare victory. Propaganda films, parades, and editorials praised the air defense crews who brought down the ghost plane. Marshal Voronov received honors. The S-75 missile system was declared a marvel of Soviet engineering. To the public, the message was clear. The skies were no longer safe for spies. But behind closed doors, Soviet commanders weren't celebrating. They were dissecting the wreckage and what it meant. The downed U-2 revealed just how extensive the CIA's aerial reconnaissance had become. The onboard cameras, film cartridges, and flight records confirmed what many in Soviet military intelligence feared. The Americans had gathered precise data on every strategic installation in the USSR, including nuclear stockpiles, missile silos, and air defense clusters. The damage wasn't just tactical, it was doctrinal. The very foundation of Soviet military theory, the belief that strategic surprise and denial of access could ensure survival, was crumbling. The U-2 hadn't just flown high, it had flown through the heart of Soviet defense planning, and by doing so, it had invalidated it. Even worse, the U-2 had exposed deep inefficiencies in the Soviet command structure. Radar stations failed to coordinate timely handovers between sectors. Interceptor squadrons lacked real-time vectoring capabilities. Missile systems had narrow engagement windows and struggled with high-altitude tracking. No amount of propaganda could cover that up. And as the 1,960 seconds progressed, the humiliation deepened. The Americans had already begun transitioning to satellite reconnaissance. The Corona program, launched in secrecy, provided near-daily coverage of Soviet territory far beyond the reach of any missile or MiG. The Soviets, playing catch-up, scrambled to develop similar capabilities but lagged by years. Worse, every major Soviet military movement from 1956 onward had likely been photographed. War games, missile tests, new base construction, even troop deployments in Eastern Europe. The U-2, while grounded, had already opened the door to total surveillance, a concept the Soviet Union was utterly unprepared for. Ideologically, it was a collapse of narrative. For decades, the USSR had portrayed itself as a fortress state, impenetrable, omniscient, undefeatable. But the U-2 had proven that a single, slow-flying, camera-equipped aircraft could fly straight through the Red Army's illusion and come home with the truth. Truth, as it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon of all. And in that truth lay the seeds of the Soviet Union's eventual unraveling, a military doctrine built on denial, a political system built on secrecy, a defense apparatus that couldn't adapt. The U-2 hadn't dropped a bomb. It had dropped a mirror, and when the Soviets looked into it, they didn't like what they saw. Today, the U-2 still flies. In a world of hypersonic missiles and satellite constellations, this relic of the Cold War, the same long-winged ghost that once mocked the Soviet Union, remains in service. Upgraded, yes, reinforced, digitalized, but still essentially the same. A high-altitude camera platform flying at the edge of space, doing what it was designed to do in 1956, see everything. That longevity is no accident. It's legacy. Because the U-2 didn't just survive the Cold War, it helped shape its outcome. For Soviet veterans, memories of the U-2 remain sharp. Many recall the helplessness, watching radar screens light up with a contact they couldn't reach. Others remember the tension of standing missile crews down after another failed track. For them, the U-2 wasn't just an aircraft, it was a ghost, flying too high to shoot down, too quiet to stop, too accurate to ignore. The CIA, for its part, buried most of the U-2's mission logs in archives classified, redacted, forgotten. But within the intelligence community, the U-2 became a symbol of what strategic reconnaissance could do. Prevent war by knowing more than your enemy was willing to admit. Francis Gary Powers, the man who fell from the sky in 1960, was eventually returned in a prisoner swap. He lived out his life under a cloud of suspicion, honor restored only decades later. His plane had fallen, yes, but the mission had not failed. The irony? The U-2's greatest power wasn't altitude, it was doubt. It made Soviet leaders question what the West knew. It made generals rethink deployments. It made Moscow uncertain about its own secrets. And in a Cold War defined by bluff and posture, doubt was a weapon more effective than any bomb. The skies above the Soviet Union were never truly closed again. From the moment the first U-2 crossed their borders, the idea of strategic invisibility died, not with an explosion, but with a photograph. Today, the U-2's shadow stretches across history. It flew without firing, it saw without speaking, and it won without war.